Out through the gate of an ancient town, there came a somber procession. A widow had lost her son. The death of a child is a gut-wrenching tragedy. But the young man, the fact that he was her only son, only deepened the anguish. Everything that she had, all she'd worked for in the past, all of her pride in the present, all of her hope for the future, now lay lifeless upon that funeral bier, and all her hopes lying shattered by the power of death. And the whole town shared in her grief, gloom descending over its streets and tenements. Her neighbors marched with her to the cemetery, the widow at the head of the crowd, followed by the funeral bier or stretcher on which the body was lifted on the shoulders of the pallbearers, and then the long lines of grievers and mourners wailing out as the body was carried through the gate and out to the graves east of the city. A woeful, forlorn assembly. But then, without warning, sweeping down from the north, there appeared another procession. And in this one, however, there was no weeping or mourning. Rather, there was shouting and there was laughter. No heads down, somberly shuffling, but faces upturned, joyously skipping along. Not a caravan of death, but a parade of life. A vibrant, enthusiastic throng of men and women and children walking in step with a man who was leading them down the road, and his name was Jesus of Nazareth. Now, many in this crowd believed that here was one who would bring hope to the downtrodden, freedom for the oppressed, and justice for the nation of Israel. And their enthusiasm gave birth to shouts of joy and acclamation as the great crowd made its way down that dusty northern road on its way toward Nain, not realizing they were heading toward a face-to-face encounter with life's ultimate tragedy. So there outside the gate of the city, life and death collided at the crossroads. Joy met sorrow, hope encountered despair, dreams ran head-on into reality. We can probably imagine how the joy of the crowd following Jesus was transformed immediately from jubilation into melancholy. And that's because in this world, whenever happiness encounters sorrow, sorrow always seems to win out. Whenever life encounters death, life is overshadowed. You could be having a great time driving through town, and then when you see the hearse pulling in front at a crossroad and the other cars going across, the mood in the car descends. No matter how cheerful the day may be, no matter how much fun we've been having, no matter how boisterous our celebration, when death shows up, it always carries the day. It always darkens the mood. All through our lives, death sort of hangs over us like a shroud. It comes in many forms and many guises. Death finds a way to every aspect of our lives. We've experienced it personally. But all we have to do, if we haven't experienced it personally lately, is just turn on the computer or pick up the newspaper or turn on the news, and we hear about things like Amnesty International right now is reporting that in the Russian Republic of Chechnya, men suspected of being gay have been abducted and tortured and killed. The Veterans Administration in this country has revealed that roughly 20 veterans a day commit suicide. And in central India, this past fall, a grandmother was stripped naked and beaten to death, and her body was burned because her Christian faith was disturbing the peace in her village. And these are just a few stories. These are merely the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Death in its many faces is a ruthless, relentless force on this earth. It has the power to hold whole civilizations captive. It has the power to break the spirit of those who quest for freedom. It has the power to crush the hopes of families longing to see their children grow up in a world free from poverty, free from pollution, free from racism, free from violence. It is constantly sending us morbid reminders that we are never far from its grasp. Death is always waiting and lurking, ready to rear its ominous head any time the procession that is our lives dares to hope for a better world. Go ahead. Make your plans. Go ahead. Believe things will get better, death whispers. Sooner or later, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, you're going to have to deal with me. And you see, that's precisely what happened 2,000 years ago outside the gate of Nain. The parade of life coming into Nain met the march of death coming out. Anyone looking on must have expected that once again death would win the day. So I want you to use your imagination, just close your eyes and picture the scene if you can. The jubilant crowd led by Jesus streaming down from over the ridge, about to slam into these funeral marchers, emerging through the city gate. And suddenly embarrassed by the inappropriateness of the raucous celebration, the crowd around Jesus stops in its tracks. Stunned by the near collision, the funeral march slows to a halt, and a tense, uneasy silence descends upon the whole scene. And realizing what's just occurred, Jesus pauses. And then he leaves his followers and walks up to the widow, standing before the stretcher that bears her dead son. And then something totally unforeseen happens. Jesus tells her, "Do not weep." Then he reaches up and places his hand on that stretcher that's bearing her dead son. And leaning over his body, he speaks these words. He says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." Great, right? Wow. But can you conceive what the grievers and mourners must have been thinking at that point? Let me ask you something. How would you feel if something like this occurred at the service of someone you loved? Someone walked in who you didn't know and said, "Stop crying," and went up to the casket and said to the body, "Rise." How would you feel? I tell you, if it were my family, I know my brothers and I would have had the urge to do. We would have the urge to have 2 funerals that day. But as the crowd of mourners fumed and muttered, the multitude that was with Jesus, they must have been very confused. Well, they probably didn't know what to make of all this. Sure, they'd seen him cast out demons and give sight to the blind and cleanse lepers, but they must have harbored some serious misgivings about what was before them now. This had really raised the stakes, for this was no mere disease or ailment or illness to cure. This was no mere demon to cast out. This was death. Dogged, unyielding, and irreversible. Someone must have just said, "Jesus, sorry dude, it's a shame. But this time you're a day late and a miracle short. There's nothing you can do now. The man is dead. Step to the side of the road and let them pass, and then we can just be on our way." But on this day, outside the gate of a town called Nain, along with a great crowd of followers, someone else was listening in. It was us. We too heard Jesus say to the man, "Arise." And with barely a hair's breadth of expectation, we strain our necks forward to see what's going to happen next. What happens next? Well, the text doesn't hesitate. It just says, the young man sat up. You heard me. He sat up. Think about that. Saints, the most unbelievable thing happened outside the gate of Nain that day. Life collided with death, but this time death flinched. This time life won out. Death in all of its sorrow and all of its dark power, death in all of its destruction, was itself destroyed. And the text tells us that all standing there was seized, it said, with an awesome fear. Because, hey, after all, they'd never experienced anything like this before. How would you feel if you were at a viewing and the person in the casket sat up? Would you be going, "Hey, praise God"? No, you'd be running. And I'd be right ahead of you. They were seized with an awesome fear because things like that just don't happen to confuse us. And when we're confused, we get afraid. But once the shock wore off, they did the only thing they could do. They glorified God. And as what happened began to hit home, and they gazed upon the tearful mother embracing her son, they knew that on this day, God had visited his people. Saints, there were two crowds that met at that crossroads outside Nain that day almost 2,000 years ago. But you know, it's up to us to decide which one with whom we will walk. Will we shuffle along beside those who accept the seeming inevitability of death? Those who will only stand by and allow death to have its day? Those who refuse to lift a hand while our society decays? Those who give in to despair while in the meantime their own lives dwindle down to dust? Or will we instead join with those who refuse to surrender? Those who celebrate the triumph of life. Those who realize that as long as we're marching with Jesus, we have the power to actually raise the dead. You know, gang, too many people choose to give in and accept the cold verdict of death. Too many lack the faith to stand up to such challenges, so they spend all their time and energy just finding a way to survive in its shadow. And that's all life is to them. And this isn't a problem solely for individuals. What happens to a church such as ours that sees the world around us as lying upon a funeral bier? Do we have the faith to say to the one pronounced dead, "Arise"? Or will we merely join in with the mourners and offer sympathy to the grieving? If we were that church, we wouldn't have gone to the Dominican Republic, would we? We would have just said, that's a shame. We'll pray for them. It's entirely up to us. But before we make up our mind, there's something we need to know. Should we choose to walk with the pessimists and the naysayers and the mourners of this world, then we've got to look forward to, all we've got to look forward to as a church is being irrelevant. Walk with the mourners, and what are we? We are nothing more than a dying church in a dying world. But saints, what if instead we make up our minds to join the procession walking in step with Jesus? Because they are the movers and the shakers who believe in the triumph of life. Nain was a city content to let the dead remain dead, but it could just as easily be Edison or Camden or Kabul or Aleppo, and that body laid upon the funeral bier could just as easily been that of a grandmother in India, or a veteran down on his luck, or a Chechnyan man persecuted for his sexuality. Just as Jesus touched the stretcher that bore the widow's son and said, "Arise," we who call ourselves New Dover United Methodist Church are called upon to reach out our hands and touch this community, this nation, and this world, and give the same command. We live in a world that desperately needs his touch and desperately needs to hear his voice, because within that voice is the word that brings life and hope, even in the presence of suffering and death. So let us ask ourselves, do we have the faith to touch the funeral bier that is our world and put a halt to the march of death that threatens to overwhelm us? Do we possess the faith to command in the name of Christ, "Arise"? Isn't it time to ask ourselves, in whose name do we march? If we answer, we walk with Jesus, remember this: he never saw himself as a mournful marcher, and neither should we. And that's because you and I have faced death before. Just one more time, just close your eyes and take another look at that funeral bier that young man was lying on. Do you recognize the one lying there? Okay, open your eyes. That body was you, and that body was me. But here's the thing, we're not lying there anymore. Because we who once were dead have been touched by his hand. We who once were dead heard his command to arise. And we who once were dead have risen up and said that we will follow you. On a day long ago outside the gate of a town called Nain, two processions came face to face. Death stopped in its tracks, but life marched on. And that life is still marching on, and the one who goes on ahead of us invites us to follow, to join in. And what sayest, New Dover United Methodist Church? It is a beautiful Sunday morning. Looks like a good day to join a parade. Let's pray.